each other. I would like to acknowledge that wherever we are this evening, we are gathered on Aboriginal land. I am currently at my home on Bidjigal land, and I pay my respects to the Bidjigal people, to their elders past and present, and to all First Nations people, arts workers, artists, creatives, and guests joining us on the webinar today. Please feel free to use the chat function to tell us which Aboriginal lands you are joining us from tonight. This is a great way for us to start sharing with each other about where we are and who we are. Please say hello and don't be shy. So my name is Beck Dean. I'm a Senior Manager of Art Strategy and Engagement at Create New South Wales. So this is the final episode of the first series of our program, Create Exchange. And this is a series of capacity building and knowledge exchange webinars, which are focused on individual creative practitioners. And over the past previous 5 episodes, we've been inviting experts from the sector to talk on particular topics. And this is the final episode. But we do have new ones coming up and special one-off webinars, so please keep your eyes out for them. Joining us from Create as well is Isha Karnik and Yanni Clark and Ros Richardson, and they're all in the background. They can drop resources and information into the links to help me and to engage with your questions as we go along. So today, with Advocate for Yourself, we were really thinking about where the rubber hits the road in terms of many things that we've discussed over this series. So a lot of the things that we've discussed have been about things that sort of exist on paper and in legislation. So we talked about setting yourself up in professional practice, getting an ABN, getting yourself sorted out to get paid. We talked about contracts, we talked about copyright, we talked about writing grants and mentorships. And in this session on advocating for yourself, this is where it all comes together in practice and focuses on you and as a creative practitioner on an individual human level. So we've got 2 fantastic guest speakers today, Ebony Wightman and Hannah Donnelly. Both work as creatives and creative workers. So they both work as practitioners who might be engaged in doing work for an organisation, or they might be part of an organisation that other people do work for. And so they're going to talk about their different perspectives on advocating for oneself in the arts and cultural context. And it's no mistake that both of our guests today represent and advocate from particular communities in aspects of the work they do. And this is because a lot of the heavy lifting in trying to make art spaces better for everybody starts with changes that are fought for by marginalised segments of our communities who challenge barriers that are put up around acknowledgement and respect and access and participation and inclusion. And in fact, all credit, this topic was suggested by Ebony Wightman for the program, and I'm really delighted that we've been able to make it happen and to actually work with Ebony. So without further ado, I'd like us to welcome Hannah Donnelly and Ebony Wightman, and thank you both for being here. And I'm just going to give you their amazing bios. So Hannah Donnelly, she, her, is a Wiradjuri curator and writer living and working on Darug country. Hannah joined UTP in 2023 as co-artistic director, bringing a new unique set of skills to arts leadership, including a background working in policy across human rights and fee-for-service cultural safety training. In 2022, Hannah established the Paul Ramsay Foundation's First Nations permanent exhibition at Yirrama Place. She was a curatorial member for Rivers, the 23rd Biennale of Sydney, and she edited Blacklight, a publication of Sweatshop, a literary anthology of First Nations storytelling from Western Sydney. Her practice and curatorial research spans Indigenous futures, Southeast Aboriginal art, and intergenerational and intercultural collaborations. Hannah's previously held roles at Arts and Cultural Exchange, Carriageworks, and Next Wave. Hello, Hannah, and thank you for joining us.
Hello.
Hey, and Ebony Wightman, she, her, is a Western Sydney artist, creative leader, and disability advocate with a passion for systems thinking, social justice, and access for all. Ebony's practice champions disability-led perspectives and explores her lived experience as an autistic person with disability. Ebony co-founded We Are Studios, Australia's first 100% disability-led studio. Hi, Ebony.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Great. And before I hand over to Hannah, I'll just point us towards some of the topics that we're likely to be discussing tonight. Among them are cultural safety, access, adjustments to working environments, remuneration, contracts, having the confidence to ask for what you need, and also a range of supports and resources. So we did this webinar because we know that advocating for yourself as an artist can be often quite daunting because of the power differential that exists between independent artists and organisations. And we hope that whatever your situation, your practice is, that this conversation might help you to build some confidence to let your presenting and collaborating partners know what you need. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah now, and I'm going to turn off this slideshow just for now so that we're not just staring at a slide, and we can listen to Hannah. So over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Beck. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So as Beck mentioned, I am a Wiradjuri woman. I've been living and working on Darug country and zooming in from Darug country with you right now. And I have been working across various organizations, like Beck said, as an artist, also as an arts worker. And so I thought I would just share some things that have worked really well for me, some thinking, some conversation. I'm really open to questions, and they'll be, if they're really relevant, Create staff will, I'm very happy to be interrupted and address questions. Also probably going to be a little bit rambling. I am just switching my brain into work mode for the first time, almost for the first time since having baby number 2. So bear with me if I am slow. I'm also hard of hearing, so I guess people aren't going to be talking to me through the Teams chat, so that's all right. And I'll just start yapping away. So I thought some really good things to reflect on would be like kind of current story at UTP. Yes. Second baby fog. Yeah, sorry, I'm just also like interacting with the chat too by looking at it. Because I have some really positive stories and examples of how I entered into a workplace in a really good way. And we'll just continue on from there and look at some of the references or resources that I use in different organizations when advocating for myself or for other artists as well. And a lot of them, you're probably already aware of those resources, and maybe hopefully there's some new things and tools that you might hear about. So like I said, so I'll start with the story of joining UTP. I have been there, I think it's almost 2 years now, and that was after baby number one. And so there were some really unique things around the way my entry into that organisation was set up. And that was informed by a lot of conversations with the co-lead. So I'm a co-artistic director there with Jess Olivieri, who is also a co-artistic director, and we're a small team based in Bankstown. And we were thinking about many things, but also what does it mean to offer leadership positions to someone in a moment where you might not necessarily think, traditionally of like offering a leadership position to someone after they've just had a baby, challenging that, but also what I would want in place as a First Nations woman to show up and take up that position, and like what my non-negotiables would be. And it's really awesome that I'm at this kind of end of my experience of working through different things that I have experienced that I know are now my non-negotiables, that I'm in a place where I can confidently present them and state them, and there's great information and research and advocacy being done around those things. So the first thing we did was have conversations mediated by a third party around writing a mutual working agreement with each other as co-artistic directors. That was about our commitment and accountability to each other. That was also acknowledging the particular time I was in. The rhythm of my productivity was a particular thing as a new mum. But it was also thinking through what my requests and needs would be as a First Nations person. And we implemented a second part, which I'll talk about after the mutual working agreement. A second part is like my cultural agreement. Some people have those. Some people use the terms cultural riders, and that is definitely informed, in the access space that Ebony will probably talk a lot more about how those kind of requests and needs are articulated and implemented. So we worked on a mutual working agreement that was about how we would work with a team as co-artistic directors, what our commitment and accountability to each other would be, what collective or consensus decision making would look like. That was very important to me, that consensus decision making would be in place, rather than artistic directors making separate, isolated decisions. And that takes time, it takes conversation. One of the resources that I use to articulate that is, I guess another little yarn is that prior to working in the arts I started working in international human rights. And for a little while, was working at the time at the Human Rights Commission when the conversations were around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples after it had just been ratified or signed. Sorry, it doesn't get ratified because it's a declaration. And also the Social Justice Commissioner at the time was writing the Social Justice Report around lateral violence. So kind of some of that human rights thinking and background informs a lot of the way I think about advocating for myself and advocating for artists. And so in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP, it talks about what free, prior and informed consent is. And I think I've popped a little link in there somewhere around like what the elements of that is, what it looks like, what it might feel like for people. But But it's probably what you would think. It is having access to information. It's about going slow. It's about having the right people to be making, the people that are affected by the decisions actually talking about the decisions, participation in decision making, and having informed consent and bringing all these elements together. And so that's a big part for me of collective decision making, is upholding free, prior and informed consent. You can try. Where was so I was talking about that collective decision making being part of my mutual working agreement with my other co-artistic director. And also you need to, obviously, at a governance level, it's very important for these things to be recognised. So the mutual working agreement, it is a working document, and continues to, like, we signed that kind of agreement to each other and commit to that, but also continue to work on it. And it's also the board is also across the mutual working agreement that we have. I think.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I was just going to interrupt and say, so it's kind of like it's something that is in place, but it's not set in stone. It's something that is worked on as you sort of progress through your process of working together.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we all know things are going to come up and things are going to change. And standards can sometimes become better articulated in better ways, as we all keep kind of advocating in the sector. So, yeah, I'm very lucky that that at the size of the organisation that UTP is, that we can be very responsive. It's also a really great way to, luckily for me, coming into a space like UTP and other organisations that I've worked in, you're kind of starting at the building of a First Nation strategy in the first place. And we all kind of, those can be different things. They can look like reconciliation action plans. They can include cultural advisory committees. They can include governance commitments to board, First Nations representation on board. They can include staffing commitments, programming commitments, all those sorts of things. Luckily, I was not having those conversations at that level walking into UTP. That was like just a given that we would, that strategy, there was a equity action plan already in place, and there were already First Nations goals and targets articulated that we could update. So yeah. In saying all of these things as well, I think, like Becky reflected earlier on, it's really, I do think a lot of these processes and a lot of this thinking that comes from First Nations people in the sector or outside of the sector. A lot of it is actually, that I've referenced, is from the health sector, is applicable across a lot of cultural groups and communities that also can adapt and reference and acknowledge and honour these things that First Nations people have used as tools, working as artists or working with organisations. I do think it's really adaptable. If anyone was thinking that, it's just great to reference where the information is coming from. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about the cultural agreement, unless there were any particular burning questions at that point.
I think I was just sort of reflecting on something from my kind of past. I won't name any names, but it was and just thinking about what you were talking about then, which is kind of like, I guess you're building the plane while you're flying the plane. Like, we use this kind of term sometimes when you're sort of trying to establish the processes that support the work that you're doing at the same time that you're doing the work and being involved in all of that. But very clearly looking to create supports that are within the structure of the organisation that can support you and support Jess in this process, rather than only kind of making an agreement between you and sort of hoping that everything will work out.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's it does have to be at a level of all levels of all levels of an organization have to be on board. And I do think a lot of people are ready for these conversations. Yeah. Sorry if I didn't particularly respond to that.
Oh no, I think I sort of went off track a little bit there. I was reflecting while you were talking, I was reflecting on an experience that I'd had where I was working with an organisation and we were like, oh, wouldn't it be really great for First Nations artists to be involved in this organisation and to have this opportunity? And we got a certain way down the path of making that possible. And then one colleague brought up the fact that that individual would not only be less senior than everyone else, but would be alone in that space.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it became a point of like, this is not an acceptable situation to put somebody in.
Well, that's the thing, is to allow artists to access spaces, to advocate for themselves as an artist, to actually do the work and make the art. There is just this is like, the reality is this is has been, you know, a lot of colonial institutions have worked in a particular way, and those as a settler colonial country, that we can't ignore the reality that for artists to show up and make the work, for artists to be able to create and dream, like, there is this change needed in the first place. Yeah. Then you can't, yeah, and that is some deep work, and it does take a lot more than just what you see on the surface. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's where a cultural agreement, I think, is a really useful thing, because either an organization is ready to work and collaborate with you, or maybe they're not, and this is like maybe a way of having those conversations about what do you need in place so you can show up and do the work on the project that you're working on, or within part of an arts organization. And so there's some really great stuff that's happened that I think I've referenced a little bit in the resources. There's obviously an acknowledgement of cultural leave for some organisations. That's obviously a bit murkier when it comes to independent contractors and what might be accessible within your contract. Yeah, so we're trialling a particular cultural leave policy at UTP for really specific cultural obligations and responsibilities of anyone in the team, including artists. And so we also have a commitment to supporting remote work. We have like some very standard commitments, like upholding the rights of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that's a lot when you look at the articles within the declaration. One interesting thing in my cultural rider, like some of it is personalized to me. One interesting thing I articulated in my cultural agreement is acknowledgement of waiting and decision making. So if it was if it was an artist who whose story or community it was within the work, or if it was another policy or strategy kind of decision, that we would think about the cultural weighting of the decision making. So where the power might, like the final, like when I earlier talked about collective decision making, this is where a cultural weighting might come into that decision making. So sorry if that sounds really technical, but I do think I have some. This is where the slides around colonial load and cultural load might be useful.
Brilliant. I'll bring them up.
Awesome. So this is really fabulous, awesome resources and thinking from a Victorian health network, First Nations controlled health network that was started up by a group of First Nations Victorian women. And they do some really cool thinking around human resources as well as health and well-being. And when they articulated, because I think a lot of us say, oh, the cultural load is just something we'd probably be more familiar with. So they have articulated the difference around reframing the cultural load. So, culture for an artist or an arts worker or a project is the strength. It's not a load. What the actual load is the colonial load, and this is like some examples of what that might be. And what's really happens every time for me personally, and I do also see it advocating for other First Nations artists, is that a lot of the time it's assumed that First Nations artists or arts workers are responsible for carrying the colonial load in a project or an organisation or doing the work. So it's kind of just thinking about reframing that. And this, like, lots of mob articulate this and talk about this in different ways, but I think Windthunga have just like done a really good job at synthesizing this. And so the colonial load is more about biases and assumptions and expectations, and which is often, like I said, the burden that First Nations people have to carry, and it does cause harm and burnout and stops artists from being able to show up and do the work, or stops kind of organizations from being able to transform into actual spaces that can work with First Nations people and communities long term. So I don't know if I need to read out those examples, but I think they really got some good ones up there. So
Shall I go to the next slide?
So then the next slide is the cultural responsibility. And that is, in language of like, self-determination, or what needs need to be met by people. So spaces can be accountable. And so we can also have good relationality with the people that we're working with, good connections and responsibility. And so that's just shifting how we think about so this is just examples that they've put together of maybe what a First Nations artist or a particular person from a community would be thinking about and speaking about, and trying to say, like, this is different. This might be what your responsibility might look like. You don't have to feel the burden of those other examples in the cultural load that are so often just placed on you. And so I think it's really nice I think it's really nice. That's a bit I think it's essential to challenge who's doing the work. And so that was something that I put in my cultural agreement. Yeah, I think distinguishing between the two things, the cultural responsibility and the cultural load, like Windthanga have done, really helps an artist know what they need and like also where their responsibility ends, so that they're not taking on the work of an organization that they might be working with, because that often is so blurry for anyone. There's a resource that I put in there, which is actually just a link to a speech by Jacob Boehm, which is like the story of like the work that it takes in I guess a little bit of a black humor way, which is like, you know, coming into an organization going to do this really amazing thing, but then like realized there was nothing set up, so had to spend a year doing consultation like as a First Nations person, and then didn't have any money, so had to find all the money, and then everybody didn't understand what they were doing, so they had to employ, you know, more staff, and then the employment was that person's responsibility. And it was just like this funny, like, but actually like real story of like how one First Nations person or one person from a particular marginalized community suddenly becomes responsible for sorting it all out. So I think using these, like using this language or other language that works for you around, that's this is like my cultural responsibility as an artist, or what I'm, you know, what I'm interested in having agreements about, and like this is your colonial load, and this is the work that you'll be doing. There's also really and maybe that's probably enough of the Windthanga resources. But there's also really good resources out there for artists that are around Indigenous cultural intellectual property. So Create New South Wales have their protocols. Creative Australia have their protocols written by Terry Jenke and company. So they are so good and so useful, and they go across, they're across many things. And they can articulate how to protect your work. So from the inception of the project through to the future use of the project, and all the relationships and all of the obligations and contractual obligations that might happen. So I know people are probably already familiar with those resources. If not, they're really useful to use either as an artist working with First Nations people, or a First Nations artist working with organizations. What like, it's so useful. The Creative Australia one literally has templates for clauses that an artist could put. And I memorize the page because it's so useful. I refer artists to it all the time. So on the Creative Australia one, I can't believe I'm going to remember this the state of my brain. And I also don't like numbers, but I think it's a page 173 where your contract clauses are, where you might be talking about traditional owners, or the future use of work, or like I think it's called a custodial notice. So obviously, if the work belongs to a group of custodians, putting a custodial notice in, or if the work is relevant to a particular language group or nation, and putting a custodial notice in there, so any future decisions about a work outside of the scope of that project has to come back to the right people for that group or nation. I've also used like really simplified clauses in contracts where I don't have a legal brain, but I just say, I've tried to go through some of my old contracts, and I didn't do it in time to include it in this, but this is just a clause I've inserted into as an artist, as an independent curator or someone working with another organization, just saying the organization, so whoever I'm working with, in good faith, presents this project, whatever the title is, in accordance with established ICIP protocols as outlined in the title of the thing that I'm talking about. That's it. And so you just whatever kind of standard that you want in your contract, that's something that you can try to negotiate with an organization.
Brilliant.
That's
Can I ask you a question about back to UTP?
Yeah.
About I guess if you have an answer from your own experience or an answer for the experience of artists who might be coming to work with you, since you and Jess have embarked on this kind of process of collective decision making and, you know, getting into a deeper way of negotiating and bargaining around the development of programs, engagement of people, are there things that you can point towards that are like, this is a thing that we did, which probably wouldn't have happened before?
Yes, absolutely. We probably just agree to spend a lot more time. So I think we're lucky that we both have a similar way of working, like within like the culture of the organization as well. And so it's really beautiful that that has opened up a conversation with the team about collective decision making with our creative producers as well. And so, you know, there's different ways we talk about what that is. And so like we have lots of sessions around like forecasting, like thinking and programming conversations with creative producers. I think Jess had some really cool titles and names for the types of like chats we would have with stuff. Like this is a big thinking session, and we have a really amazing general manager who comes up with like, this is like a collective conversation, but we need to know that this is what we're going to talk about in this session. And yeah, so I think what I'm trying to say is when you agree to these ways of working and standards for like across a particular, so that was across a particular like management relationship, it informs the rest of the way that you work as an organization, which is really cool.
It kind of seems to me like it might engender a process of working that is a lot slower, more intentional, and probably builds relationships over time. Because I think, you know, we're so many different ways of programming, but if you're just like slotting things into a timetable, that doesn't sound like what you're doing.
Yes, exactly. Thanks, Beck, for putting that out. That is 100% the work. It is, you know, long-term development based on kind of relational practice and relational practice to, it could be, you know, artists in the community or just artists, but like we are very much informed by having like a long-term relationship with an artist, not like beyond just a project idea, but like more about their practice, and specifically Western Sydney artists and other artists connected to really relevant Western Sydney conversations. But that long-term development, yeah, that's what we have been shifting more and more to, and pretty much is like mostly, you know, and there are beautiful presentations along the way, which is really cool from those relationships we have with artists. But it's not about, okay, we're going to work with you on this project, and then that's the end of our relationship as an organization with you. Yeah. It's yeah, a really wonderful space to be, where your relational practice is embedded in the programming in the organization. Yeah. And I think it's also hopefully also doing some of the deep thinking around these ways of implementing things in our organization is helping the artists that we're working with when they go out to other presenters and when they're working or developing other projects as well. We hope.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've let you talk for a while. No, I mean, in terms of giving you a bit of a break now. Yeah. And we do have one question from Cameron that asks how you got your first gig.
Oh, that's a fun question. It depends what the first gig is. Like maybe if it's I guess that's a good question actually, like thinking about where people come from working as artists or arts workers, is that I wasn't that I came through my own practice of creative writing, and particular interest in Indigenous futurisms and cli-fi and speculative fiction. So for a while I was just doing my own creative projects. And then I was working across, like I said, social justice and policy. I was working in community-controlled health space for a little while I was doing my own creative practice. But I guess my first arts worker position came about. I was working as a producer, an associate producer, was my first gig, technically, when I was down in Melbourne, and then have had different roles along the way. But I think, yeah, that's a really good question, because some people have a tertiary kind of pathway, tertiary education pathway, and some people have lived experience as artists and then arts workers pipeline.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks so much for sharing that presentation with us, and we will put all these resources up on the website, as well as a separate kind of attachment, so that you can get into those. And thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over now to Ebony Wightman. Hi, Ebony.
Hi, everybody. So nice to be here. I'm going to come at you at a pretty practical standpoint today. You've heard my bio already, so I'm not going to bore you with that. But first, I guess I'd kind of just like to talk about the language that I'll be using. So I personally like to use identity first language, so saying deaf person or disabled person rather than people living with disability. And that's a personal choice for me, because it affirms that being disabled is an integral part of who I actually am, not something separate. And it recognizes me as both a person and a disabled person, fully integrated and inseparable. I also acknowledge that many people will prefer to use person first language or use different terms altogether. The language that we use in the disability space is always changing, and the way that people or the language people use to describe themselves reflects their unique lived experience. And every person's personal choice deserves respect, and that's my one today. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk about cultural safety for a minute as well. So I personally struggle with the term cultural safety because it's actually something that I can't promise anyone. It's not something that I can guarantee or anyone else can guarantee. What I can do is actually put practices, though, in place that aim to reduce harm and centre lived experience and make spaces safer, more respectful, inclusive and equitable. Creating a safer culture for deaf and disabled people should go beyond access. It's more than ramps, captions or interpreters. It's actually about power, respect and a sense of belonging. Cultural safety in the context for deaf and disabled people, we share a distinct identity, community and culture that's been shaped by a very, very long history of exclusion, resistance, and most importantly, resistance. It acknowledges the collective experience of ableism and discrimination and the shared language, practices, and pride that have emerged in response to those. But safety itself is not a fixed state, as we all know. It's something that has to be continually worked towards collectively. Next slide, please. So I've put together a list of kind of green flags for cultural safety in the arts, opposite of red flags if you're colorblind. These are things that I look for when I'm about to start working with another organization, entity, or person. And, you know, not every organization will be able to meet all of these, of course, but they're really good things to just look out for that kind of say, this potentially is a safe space for me as a deaf or disabled person. So basically, access from the start. The organization actually raises access first with everybody, not just people who may appear visibly disabled or deaf or have access needs. Their disabled leadership is loud and proud. So the deaf and disabled people hold real power in leadership, programming, curation, and governance, not just consulted, but actually leading the pack. Lived experience is centered, not tokenized as well. So policies, programs, and like creative works are created by deaf or disabled people. Access is embedded from the start. It's not a last minute scramble or an additional tack on. Care-based flexible processes. This one's very important. So workflows, rehearsals, and communications that can adapt to people's needs, their styles and pacing. So it's centered in care, not necessarily productivity, which in our world is not so easy, but when you find the right people, that is something that they take into context. Agency and choice over how and what we create. So deaf and disabled artists or creators having the choice in how they create or collaborate and engaging on their own terms. And then access also being seen as a shared responsibility. It's not something that you're supposed to come in and then enlighten everybody about. It's something that's not left to you as an individual to advocate for alone. It's a collective commitment felt by everybody in the organization or collective. And accountability is built in. So there are clear and safe pathways to actually give feedback or raise concerns. You should know about that from the very beginning because as a person with disability or any other marginalized background, knowing who to talk to when these things happen can really stop things from escalating. And then inclusion as a continual process, not just a checkbox. So there's actually, you know, an organization has a curiosity, humility, and like a willingness to grow. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I'm off my slide game. Oh.
That's okay. So access needs, for those who don't know about access needs, which is a lot of people, and that's totally fine. It's something or anything a person requires to fully participate in a space, event, activity, community, or workplace. So it's whatever supports you to basically show up, engage, and feel genuinely included. But advocating for your access needs isn't always easy. In fact, knowing what your access needs are can be a privilege to begin with. Not everybody has had the time, support, or safety to figure those out yet. And I know a lot of people from intersectional backgrounds, specifically those from culturally diverse backgrounds, people who English is a second language, often don't have the support that they need to be able to do that as well, and First Nations people too, of course, and who are also more likely to experience disability themselves. So it takes self-awareness and understanding of how you work, how you don't work, what barriers you face as a deaf or disabled person, and what changes might make participation possible. It also takes courage. So disclosing your access needs often means revealing parts of yourself that not everybody feels safe or ready to share, and that's totally okay. Advocating for your access can be hard, it can be scary, but it can also be very powerful and deeply affirming. You're not actually asking for special treatment, you're actually asking for equity. Next slide, please. So when you're working with a new institution or organization and you've gone through those green flags and you've gone, yeah, okay, these guys seem all right. Here's a few little questions that I kind of have come up with that to ask yourself or help someone else to ask of themselves as well if you're supporting them. So assess the environment, number one. So check if it's actually safe to share. Ask yourself, do I feel safe disclosing my disability in this space? Is it a supportive or disability literate space? So do the people here know about disability and the types of access needs and supports that could be available? Do you trust the people you're working with? Have you been able to build a relationship? And I think Hannah was talking about that earlier about equity in relationships and partnerships there. And that's something that's really important. So, you know, that might take a while to actually get on top of, but once you know that you can trust the person, then you're able to share a lot more. And remembering that you don't have to share your diagnosis or disability upfront. Yeah, if it feels unsafe, you can focus on what actually just helps you to participate. So things like I work best with written communication or clear agendas in advance rather than, you know, I'm an autistic person. Asking if the organization has worked with deaf or disabled people before and what they tried to, or what they did to try and support them is also a really good one. That can be a big red flag if they've never actually worked with deaf or disabled people before and they're just diving into the deep end there. And of course, it can be a learning opportunity too. And you just have to decide whether you're the one to be that first go. And asking people who have worked with the organization before about their experiences. So, you know, deaf and disabled people, I hope you have a community. As you know, it's really important to have people around you who have similar shared experience. So, and ask those people if they worked with them, were there any barriers or challenges that you should be aware of? Was it a positive or negative experience, and would they work with them again, most importantly? Because, you know, everyone can have their different challenges and they're all individual, but I think if you weren't willing to work with them again, then that's a red flag as well there. Has the organization demonstrated a commitment to access and inclusion, or is it uncharted territory? And then lastly, is this a large, well-funded organization or institution with plenty of resources, or a small nonprofit with a limited budget? So with a smaller nonprofit, for example, you might need to be flexible about how your access needs are met. However, a large organization might have the resources, but not actually prioritize them as much. So I myself have had mostly the best experiences with smaller organizations who've really gone out of their way to meet my access needs, and larger organizations, because it's been part of their processes, it hasn't been as much of a priority. Next slide, please. So here are some tips that I've put together for sharing your access needs as well. So I guess the first one is support with forms. Like if you need help with actually filling out forms or understanding them to share your access needs, that's your number one. Like that's the start, because we want to get everything in writing if we can. Number two is asking who to talk to. If no one's actually mentioned access, it's totally fine to ask them, like, who can I speak to about access for this project? And if they don't have an answer to that, you say, well, you know, it's time to come up with somebody to talk to me about it. Put it in writing if possible, and I'll reiterate this a lot throughout this entire webinar. So email or written communication gives you a record of your requests, and it helps people to refer back to your needs, which is super important, and reduces the stress of actually having to put it all out on the spot as well. And being specific too, instead of saying I need support in meetings, like actually put in specific access needs there. So I need help with note taking and breaks every 45 minutes, for example. And your needs are totally still valid, even if you're still figuring them out. So I'm still working out what I need, but I know this part isn't working is totally okay to share. And you might be able to come up with a solution together on that one as well, because they might have had different experiences and have some support options that might be available to you. And access needs change, and that's also totally okay. You can update them at any time because access is flexible, and an organization or partner that you're working with should be really open to that happening as well, and that shouldn't be a challenge. This is something I always do, but I understand that's a big privilege that I have. So bringing someone with you, a support person or an advocate, can help you communicate your needs when you're unable to, is really, really important. And, you know, if you're working in the arts, maybe you get a buddy basically system, like you come with them to support them and they come with you. I think that's a good idea, and it's something that we have kind of been doing through We Are Studios through peer support there. And following up, so asking the people you're working with how they plan to address any barriers or making necessary adjustments. Get that in writing. So it's all well and good to actually just give them your access rider or the adjustments that you need, but you need them to say, this is actually the plan. This is what we're going to do to help you. And keep your receipts. I think this is a really sneaky and smart one that I've come up with. So keeping a printed copy of your access rider or written requests, especially when attending an event, because they don't always have access to emails. There might not be Wi-Fi. They have to go through a million things to find your access needs. But if you have it written there, you can hand it to them and say, like, here we go. You said yes to this, and I'm so good. I've printed it out for you. And then revisiting your needs over time. So this is something you can do. You can also schedule it into your work agenda as well. So letting people know about your access needs, that they actually might change, and then check in about what is working and what's not working. And that's also okay. Next slide, please. So this again is some workplace adjustments. So workplace adjustments are actually just when your access needs are being met. That's when it becomes a workplace adjustment. So for me, no one has actually ever gotten it right. For me, sometimes they can actually get it so wrong that you're pretty sure they took all of your access needs and decided to actually do everything you didn't want to do instead. If it's possible, if you're actually going to a space to work in or for a project for an event, visit the space if you can that you'll be working with. Assess together what needs to be done and agree to it in writing again. Double check, triple check, how many checks you can do, I can't reiterate. If you can, arrange a site or environment walkthrough just before the actual event, because things also change. So that whiteboard that you saw and was like, oh, that'll be great, could be on the other side of the room now. And ensure, like, at the start of your contract that everything's been set up as required. So also request accessible presentations at least a week in advance. Auslan interpretation, I don't need to preach this. The deaf people know what they're doing, but ask to be copied into confirmation emails about actually booking those guys. And do test runs with any software, computers or technology, because they like to break when you need them most. So make sure they work the way that everyone expects them to, and ask if there is Wi-Fi, because you know, if you're a person who is vision impaired or blind and you turn up to a place and you have an e-reader and you haven't downloaded it, it's difficult to partake. And also, don't assume every conversation that you've had is enough. People forget, follow up and make checklists, basically. Let the organisation or workplace know what's worked well for you in the past. Share any adjustments you manage independently and how they can support you to keep doing that. And pre-book planning meetings for access needs in advance. Ongoing work, schedule regular check-ins and feedback sessions. That one's very, very important. And after each event or program, ask for a debrief to reflect on what worked well and didn't. I know that can be really hard and especially a struggle if it wasn't the greatest experience, but this is the only way often that people will learn from mistakes and accidents and things like that. So, and also don't be afraid of needing a support person to support you to communicate your needs or supporting you with your workload. I myself get my partner to answer my emails, take notes and manage my diary. And if someone asks me when something is on, I give them a blank stare and tell them to ask Jordan, who is to the left of me right now. Next slide, please. So tips for the bad times. What happens if your needs are actually not being met, which happens a fair bit. So if you're feeling stressed and you don't know why, maybe it's because your access needs aren't actually being met or communicated effectively. So review that written communication again that you've got about your access needs and check if anything has been misunderstood or overlooked. Next slide, please. I've put these together because this is something I need to do regularly for myself, and I fail at it all the time. So I think this is important for everybody, regardless of whether you're a person with disability, because working with organizations isn't always easy and your health and wellness matters the most. So take a moment to pause when you're feeling that bad thing in your stomach and things are going poorly and say, is it safe for me to continue working right now? Then go, am I able to communicate my needs clearly? Again, right now. Is this something that can be resolved in the moment? Is there someone here who can support or advocate with me? Can my needs actually realistically be met in this environment right now? And am I able to continue despite my access needs not being met? And if the answer to these is mostly no, it's okay to take a break or actually leave completely. Like, your well-being comes first. You are not difficult for having boundaries. Next slide, please. And so after, you've gotten past that point of the right now, and you're trying to assess the situation and see whether it's something that you're happy to continue with, these are some kind of follow-up questions that you can ask yourself. And I can't give you the answers to these, unfortunately, because life's not that easy, but it's something that you can kind of weigh up with yourself or a support person. So have the people I shared my access needs been open to feedback? When I raised issues, did they take action? Do I have the energy to keep advocating for myself right now? And is it worth my time, or is it pulling me away from things that actually matter more? Is this affecting my health or well-being? Can I actually see it improving? Will this cost me emotionally or financially? And will I be too depleted after this to take on future opportunities? That's something that's really important to ask yourself, because I can't tell you the amount of times that I've taken part in something and I got paid, a very small fee, and I worked so hard and I was done for the next few weeks. And then I wasn't able to actually participate in those things that really were the priority for me work-wise. Next slide, please. And then think ahead. So before you make this decision on whether you want to continue or not, ask these questions. So what are the possible outcomes of speaking up? Financial, professional, and reputational. What are the costs of staying silent? What support do I need to move forward? And basically knowing that your energy is also a limited resource and you need to use it wisely. I have next slide, please. I'm going to go through these ones kind of quickly, because I imagine that, we've talked contracts and things like that before, but I'm not a lawyer, and the person that you're dealing with is probably also not a lawyer. So approach contracts and negotiations as equals, and be polite and direct, because I think that that's the best way to work. At We Are Studios, we've worked with a wide variety of organisations and partners with very different levels of staffing, money and organisational skills. But our big tip has basically been have a signed agreement for any project over $1,000. Be careful if you hear things like it's in the mail or it's coming later, it's held up by Janet in marketing or whatever. That department, this might mean that they are really disorganized, which means you want to make sure that you have an email from them explaining how much you're being paid and what you will be paid and what you are being paid for. Next slide, please. Understanding a contract. So professional legal advice isn't typically affordable or necessary, in my opinion, for smaller projects. My personal experience is that for small projects, clear email trails, again, that explain deadlines and project requirements, as well as pay and budgets, are seriously the most important thing. And the bigger the project, the more likely it is that you actually do need to ask advice from someone who can read over the contract, whether that's an arts lawyer, your own lawyer, or someone that you know that has management experience, or a friend or someone else you trust. And again, not everyone has access to these people with these experiences. So I guess these are some tips that I have for you. Next slide, please. Check how much you're being paid. Be clear on the total amount. When am I getting paid? Lock payment dates into your calendar and send your invoices to avoid delays. And also, what am I being paid for again? So make sure that the contract spells out what you are doing for the money. So tasks, timeframes, deadlines. And for visualize like myself, this might be listed as separate budget lines, like creating works or exhibiting works or workshop fees, artist talks, blah, blah, blah. Next slide, please. Oh no, back. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Yeah, that one. Thank you. So knowing your rights is pretty important, I hear. So checking NAVA rates, they're actually not legally binding, but they are a solid guide. So generally, the bigger the organization, the more you should expect them to pay at least NAVA rates. You're not a charity. You don't subsidize wealthy organizations with your time or labor. And are you getting paid super? Whether you're a contractor or a casual, this matters. The ATO and Fair Work have solid plain English advice for you if that's something that you're finding difficult. If you're unsure, ask. If you're not getting super, ask why, and make sure that you really understand and that they've made it accessible to you. And then, does the contract explain the project budget? It should really clearly state who's paying for what. So if it's vague or confusing or missing any key information, ask the organization to revise it and make it clearer to you. You are not being difficult, you're actually being professional. Your access time and contribution matters. Next slide, please. And what if things go wrong? This is a big one for people with disability in particular. What if you get sick or the project stalls or your access needs change, basically? So make sure the contract explains what happens if you can't finish on time, including whether you still get paid or if you need to return funds. So don't ever rely on a verbal, it'll be fine, get that in writing. Are your access costs also covered? If you need Auslan interpretation or support workers or assistive technology, etc., are these costs in the project budget itself, or are you being expected to use your NDIS funds if you have those? A lot of the times that will be an assumption that's been made. If the contract doesn't mention access, ask for clarification and request that access expenses are formally included. Deadlines, milestones, and deliverables. Are they actually realistic? You really need to look at this one. I'm very bad at it. So projects really often run late, especially with disability, chronic fatigue, illness, or life just throwing you out of whack. Make sure the timeline works for you with enough wiggle room. You don't need to burn out to prove your worth. And then what if the organization is late? Because arts organizations are always on time. If they don't send you key information or resources on time and it delays your work, that's actually on them. You should not be penalized. So push back if needed, explain how delays actually knock your schedule over by weeks. So 1 week late on their end might actually mean you now need a month due on other commitments because you have limited energy. And again, that's not a failure. That's actually planning around your capacity. Next slide, please. So this is just about contracts and gut feeling. So basically, if it feels off or it doesn't make sense, again, ask for clarification. unclear, like cagey information about payment, just walk away. That's honestly my best advice. If you can't get them to come through and make sure that you understand it and that they understand it and that it is written, you actually have no obligation to continue. That's setting boundaries. And if someone's actually already trying to potentially shortchange or manipulate you, that's not a future partnership. That's actually a mess waiting to happen. And then my very, very last piece of advice is use a calculator or a spreadsheet loving friend. So get them to double check what you're being paid. Add up the individual fees. Do they match the overall project total? And if they don't, speak up. If it's less, ask for a correction. If it's more, I guess you still speak up, because honesty builds trust with the right people. And knowing your worth and your numbers is actually power. And then I guess the last thing that we were going to talk about is also having the confidence to ask. But I imagine that the Q&A session, that will probably be talked about a fair bit. So that's me to you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Ebony. It was so thorough. And talking about thorough, there's a whole range of resources and information that Ebony has put together, which we will also drop into the website when this document when this is downloaded and put on there. So Ebony's a whole load of tools are here that she's put in about access riders, a whole load of resources about diversity, disability, accessibility in arts and culture, and one that we've sort of put together which is really about all of the sort of peak bodies and other organisations and resources that you can engage with to find out more about, you know, fee structures, other supports, contracts, your legal kind of advice, and things that are kind of there to support different kinds of facets of the sector. And one of the things that was really clear to me through that presentation, Ebony, was that though you were presenting through a disability lens, a lot of those, you know, the requests for particular things that are coming more into play in the relationships that we have, you know, that are established between artists and organisations now, to account for just the different ways in which we live our lives. And I think the different ways that artists live their lives.
Everybody has access needs. It's the reason we have lunch breaks at work. Everyone needs to eat, right?
Yeah. And I think that the time where, you know, you should just be grateful for the for the exposure that you're getting for being participant in a program is shifting that that idea around at the moment. You can see people, I mean, thinking about Hannah's experience as a recent mum, again, you know, you can't always be available at the exact same time as an organisation wants to have its production meetings. There are, you know, more people taking on the role of childcare, after school care now because it's so unaffordable. There's a whole range of like issues around access that are caused by economic concerns, you know, so there are lots of different things that are barriers to participation. And what you've done is present something that, you know, like everybody should be able to relate to at some level. So thank you so much for that. It's fantastic. Now, does anyone have any questions for our wonderful guests today? And outside of that, I did want to reflect on that you both talked about power structures. And I was reflecting on Hannah's talking about the sort of, not the flattening, but the sort of, a sort of different way of approaching decision making that involved different layers of your organization and not just a hierarchical top-down kind of functionality there. And alongside that, sort of the approach that Ebony has to the contract, which is at this point in time, we are equals, let's talk. And I think there are some common themes coming through there.
Yeah. Power dynamics are something very difficult to deal with, but I think when you prioritize yourself as being an equal party, that's when, you know, the other person understands, right? Oh, I can't take advantage, or we're both on the level playing field here, regardless of your experience. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I do think there is a very intentional, like from the UTP board conversations prior to me joining, and then Jess and I in our conversation, there really is an intentional, when you mentioned like flattening the power structure, there is like an intentional kind of thinking around collective systems as organizations. Like we're not definitely not perfect, would have so much more work to do to get to that point. But I mean, it's really interesting to look at models that exist out there. And there is a...
That's awesome.
What's the question?
Oh, was there someone with a question there?
No, it's okay. I think
there are like existing. I found out about the concept of holocracies and Darwin Community Arts operating as a holocracy more recently, and things that we can aspire to that is like real systems change level. I think we're just slowly getting there, but it is something that the governance really needs to be engaged with and on board with. And so, you know, that's why conversations around governance are so important as well, that they, from the organisation from the top down to, you know, the representation of board members, it really matters.
Absolutely. We do have two questions from Madhulika Singh, who says, thank you all for the lovely words of wisdom. And her questions are, how do you approach conflict in professional relationships as someone advocating for their access? Any takers, Ebony?
Yeah, I can speak to this one a little bit. I guess first my question would be, you know, conflict itself is a strange word, because whether somebody is actually like whether it's conflict or whether you're both just feeling uncomfortable is also a realistic outcome when you're raising issues and things like that, because we're all human and people feel like, oh, I've done a great job and then it's not been the best, so how do we kind of go forward from here? My suggestion to you would be to always be polite, right? I know that's a big weight on people's shoulders, and it's not always easy or possible, but it's really the way to get things done that I've found personally. And if you can't do it, again, get a support person to help you to do it, because it's really, really difficult to get across your needs when you're feeling like you can't talk, or you're not being respected in that space, and having a third party can be really valuable. But also don't take on that other person's perspective. Like, don't let it influence you. If you're talking about access needs, that's just something that allows you to participate or be in the room. Like, you're not actually asking them to, you know, hurt themselves or to like do something bad to themselves. You're just asking them to make an adjustment. And if that's not something that that person is able to do without being aggressive or hurting you with their perspective, I guess, then again, that's not okay. So you just outline what you need and you say that that's not negotiable. Some things will be negotiable. And if they're not, then you refer back to your contract and your access rider, and again, what you had got in writing. And if they're unwilling to kind of make those accommodations, then you have to again assess whether it's the right place for you, and whether you're going to actually be able to do your job at all.
Thank you, Ebony.
That's all right.
There's a second part of that question, the second question from Madhu is how to prevent personal friendships from affecting professional workplace relations during time of conflict and stress.
I'm happy to kind of reflect on that one a little bit, following up from how kind of Ebony articulated how important it is to understand, contracts and also what your boundaries are and what conflict actually means for people. It can, from personal friendships and relationships, that's a very interesting one. Particularly if you're working with an organization that doesn't have these structures set up well. It means that, if there are collaborative projects or there is work with particular communities, that sometimes there is more conflict because we're pushing against these, inequities, or we're pushing against these systems that are not built for working with us. So that creates more conflict. And also kind of, if you're the person bringing it up and it's hard or it's awkward or people are dismissing those things, it's really hard. I have thinking about mediation and conflict resolution, when I was talking about my agreements before, I have kind of like 3 tiers that I write in an agreement, which is like the first one, if I am responding to a disagreement, my first level will be I will do a written request for a pause and reset on something. And so they'll know this is my first kind of I'm responding to something through my conflict resolution lens. The second part for me is, and Ebony mentioned this, would be then a formal written request for facilitated mediation. And that would be with an agreed person or an agreed consultant. And then obviously you have, not obviously, sorry, it's actually quite, sometimes for different organisations or institutions, depending on their size, there is formal dispute resolution processes. So most organisations should have complaints policies and procedures and feedback procedures. And I would just actually say that's a really key thing that we should all be using is people's complaints policies and procedures. And so actually formally complaining when something happens, because they will have a complaints and feedback procedure that has to be that will kick into action once a formal complaint is received. And you should be able to request that your complaint is anonymous within that process, depending. I'm not 100% sure on the legality of that, but I'm pretty sure that most arts organisations would respect anonymity within a complaints process. Yeah.
Fabulous, thank you. And finally, before we hit the 7 o'clock mark, Liam has a question. Thank you both for the wealth of knowledge and sharing your experience. May I ask, when is a time you had to say no to a project or organisation because it didn't match your values or they wouldn't meet your needs?
I could speak to this one a little bit.
You don't have to name the organisation.
No, I'm definitely not doing that. So this is actually a funny one because when I talk about those questions previously to ask yourself and like do your research, do they align with your values? Do they, all these things? Sometimes it can appear really great. And then once you're in there, the cracks start to show as well. We had we've recently said no to a really big opportunity that was a multi-year contract for some substantial amount of money. And we had to say no to that because even though the mission and the values of that organization on appearance were really pro-access, equality, and for people with disability, when it came down to it, like even the most basic of access needs weren't able to be met when requested, and we had to weigh up whether reputational damage, even though most people wouldn't see that from outside of dealing with them as a partner, we couldn't do that. We couldn't justify it. And it was a really big and time-consuming conversation that we had to do, and we used collective decision-making on that one as well. And it was really interesting that even though, you weigh up all of those things, that if your human rights are not being met, or, your dignity is not being respected, you can't put a price on that. It's that was a big decision. So again, you can do all of the work and still get into a situation and then realize, no, it's not working out. And also you can have worked with them for a little while too, to before you realize that as well. And sometimes that you can be angry at yourself for that too. But I think we all go into things with, open hearts and minds, and that's the way things should be. But we do have to think about keeping ourselves safe, and the load that is on top of our shoulders as people from marginalized backgrounds and people who live intersectional lives. Yeah.
I think something you said then really stuck out for me, Ebony, was like the like through a risk framework, the reputational kind of impact. I guess for us that means something. Well, sorry, I can't speak for everyone, but I guess that means a really different thing depending on where you sit. And so, like, obviously, relationality in organizations is different compared to a big institution where, artists, if you're artist centered and if you do work with artists in a self-determined kind of practice methodology where the people are the people affected, or that community are the ones telling those stories. The risk framework you're thinking through is very different to, a lot of the time risk frameworks are, the key kind of conversation will be, what's the risk in our financial risk? What's the risk in our sector? How will we look to our funders and things like that? But we take our relational risk really seriously. So like the artists that we work with, the communities that we work with, like that's just as serious of a risk for us to consider. And if we do something and that's at odds with the values or principles and ways that we work with those communities and what they stand for, because art is political, then that's a real risk to us, because those artists won't work with us and we won't have work. And so articulating that to the board in a risk framework has been really useful. Sorry, I went a little bit off topic, but what Ebony said, I think we think through, we can think through those ideas of relational risk really expansively to our benefit when often people are trying to shut us down.
Well, it has drawn up to just past 7. And I just want to thank you both for engaging so thoughtfully with this topic, and for raising a lot of really important ideas and questions, and I'm sure a lot of resources for people to percolate on and to get into over the next while. I also want to thank you for sort of rounding out this series for us of Create Exchange. I hope it's been really useful to the people on the the webinar now, for people downloading the resource later on. We will be keeping these resources up on the web for a time, so people can access them after this point. But yeah, just want to really thank you both for being such fantastic guests, and yeah, can't thank you enough for the work that you've put into this. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I do have, oh, I thought I had another slide. No, I had a thank you slide. But basically, we will be surveying people who've come to view our webinars to find out what you thought, to find out what you'd like to hear about in the future, and hopefully to bring you back in when we start them up again. Thank you very much, and happy Monday night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan, too. See, Gil.